To many scholars of the present day, the Zephyrites represent diligence and dedication to a noble cause. To the average Tyrian, they have become synonymous with exotic wares, bright, colourful festivals, and strange air magic. Even their name alludes to the wind that carries their ships aloft amongst the clouds. Roaming the skies, far above the world below, their peaceful way of life belies the tragedy and conflict in their history. The story of the Zephyrites begins with a dragon. Kralkotoric's sire Glaust rose from champion in the Crystal Army to a figurehead of rebellion against the dragon's tyranny. Glint, as she became known, eventually allied herself with a group of humans to protect her legacy in 1125 AE, ensuring that the reign of the Elder Dragons would be challenged no matter her own fate. It is these humans that later came to be known as the Zephyrites. Glint's servants lived in secrecy for hundreds of years, helping her wherever they could, trusting in her plan. But in 1320 AE, after a momentous attempt to challenge and slay Kralkotoric, Glint was killed. The news devastated her followers, none of whom had been with her when she met her fate in the jaws of her sire. The Zephyrites made the perilous journey across the Crystal Desert to retrieve her magic. Crystals, such as those that formed her body, are second only to bloodstone in their capacity to store magic, and over the centuries of her life, Glint had absorbed a great deal of power. Fearful that the magic stored within her flesh would be used for evil, the Zephyrites sought to protect it from falling into the hands of scavengers and powermongers, who would use it for their own advancement and gains. The trek took its toll, but still they persisted, reaching Glint's lair on the 11th of the season of the Scion, 1320. Here the Zephyrites found great crystal fragments of Glint's body, strewn on the ground where she lay. Upon touching them, they released the strange magic they held within them. The Zephyrites found that they could walk on the wind, ride lightning, or channel the sun to their will. They took all the crystals that they could find, and carried them back with them to their community. Amongst the cliff sides of Destiny's Gorge is one of the better preserved Zephyrite settlements. Now inhabited by Elonian refugees fleeing the Forged, many of the original structures and furnishings remain. Zephyr's Trace was most likely one of the last villages inhabited by the Zephyrites before their exodus into the skies of Tyria. Upon this plateau, amongst these now crumbling and swaying scaffolds, the Zephyrites constructed airships that were to become their home thereafter, including the towering Zephyrite flagship, the Zephyr Sanctum. The Zephyrites chose to live amongst the clouds to pursue their studies of Glint's magic in peace and seclusion. By taking the fragments of her body with them, one Zephyrite wrote of a desire to transport her to a resting place of fresh breezes and gentle sun, away from the inhospitable, lifeless, and cruel desert landscape. Over the years, the Zephyrites studied their crystals and came to hone their ability to use the magic within them. Split into 3 types, sun, wind, and lightning, the magic became known as aspects. Amongst the Zephyrites arose 3 individuals most dedicated to studying and understanding these aspects. Known as the Aspect Masters, they grew to have the most knowledge about each magic type, and acted as teachers and mentors to the rest of the Zephyrites. During their studies of the crystals, the Zephyrites came to an important discovery. The crystalline remains of Glint held a finite amount of magic, and over time the Zephyrites realised it may deplete entirely. To combat this, they devised a way to perpetuate her power by growing new crystals. Seeding them with magic from the dragon's remains, these crystals would grow into conduits of sun, air, or lightning magic, and the Zephyrites would have an endlessly renewable source of power. Exactly how these manufactured crystals were grown is unknown. The Zephyrites keep their means of production a closely guarded secret. But the remains of Zephyrite mines here in Destiny's Gorge suggest some form of crystalline base was needed for their manufacture, and modern Zephyrite crystal gardens remain the best place to procure the clearest quartz. Comprising of scores of buildings, twisting walkways and teetering platforms, the Zephyr Sanctum was carried through the skies by great sails. Held aloft by the Zephyrites' magic, they could steer their floating city across Tyria, and they travelled where they wished for many years. It wasn't until 1326 AE that the ship returned to the surface of Tyria, where it docked briefly in the labyrinthine cliffs to attend the Bazaar of the Four Winds. The Bazaar was always somewhat of a secretive affair. Traders, gathering unregulated and therefore untaxed, were able to trade at rates that undercut the other official routes present in cities across Tyria. This suited the Zephyrites well. Their travels had taken them across Tyria, far beyond where most other traders could travel, and as such they had access to many fantastic, unique and exotic wares. Their presence drew the attention of Lion's Arch, whose citizens, eschewing most rules and regulations, were always staunch supporters of the Bazaar. The Master of Peace, the most prominent member of the Zephyrites, who acted as their spokesperson and made many of the decisions that governed their society, encouraged trade between Lion's Arch and his people, motivating the then rivals Ellen Keel and Yvonne Nashblade to settle their differences through a public election. When Keel was elected to the Captain's Council, the Master agreed to the historic trade agreement that is still honoured today. All was well for a while. Visitors flocked to the cliffs to trade and enjoy the festivities. It was around this time that the Master of Peace left the Sanctum. He sought an audience with Ogden Stonehealer. The dwarf was one of the last remaining on the surface of Tyria, and belonged to the Brotherhood of the Dragon, the original organisation that allied themselves with Glint before their race's exodus beneath the surface of the world. Together, Ogden and the Master set up a portal into Glint's long empty lair. Contained within an ornate hourglass, amongst the grains of sand, this portal allowed the Master to travel into Glint's domain. There he was bequeathed the most precious gift. Glint's last remaining egg was entrusted to his care. During their time in the labyrinthine cliffs, the Zephyrites' ethos attracted many others who attempted to join their sanctum. Amongst them were fellow merchants, looking to trade and travel, and those individuals who sought a different pace of life away from the trials of the surface. However, the Master of Peace was hesitant to accept many new members onto their voyage, and the sanctum ascended to the skies after only a few weeks, leaving many hopeful converts behind. It wasn't until the following year, when returning to aid Lion's Arch after the decimation wrought by Scarlet's Breachmaker, that the Master of Peace permitted select recruits passage onto the sanctum. When they departed the labyrinthine cliffs that year, their journey was different to before. The Master of Peace, conscious that the destruction and conflict that still plagued Tyria would endanger Glint's egg, sought to travel further in the aim of transporting it somewhere much safer where it could hatch. The sanctum set off towards the Maguma jungle, presumably seeking the city of Tyria and the guardianship of the Exalted who waited there. But for all the secrecy and measures to protect the egg, it wasn't long before it was placed in danger. Scarlet's attack on Lion's Arch had awoken the elder dragon Mordramoth with a sudden surge of ley magic. As the dragon woke, it sensed the presence of Glint's egg and immediately began working to obtain it. The dragon sent its corruption out across Tyria, from the tangible, tangled and thorned vines that sprung up across the jungle and surrounding areas, to the insidious, imperceptible tendrils that wormed their way into the minds of the Sylvari. Mordramoth reached out to surround the egg. Unfortunately for the Zephyrites, one of their own succumbed to the call of the dragon. A new recruit called Erin began plotting to overthrow the Master of Peace and claim the egg. He planted explosives across the Zephyr's sanctum, and as they sailed over the Maguma wastes, they were detonated. The airship became entangled with several other ships as it fell from the sky, and came crashing down against the bleak sandscape of Drytop. The wreckage burned, and many Zephyrites lost their lives. A makeshift field hospital was set up and run by Seraph volunteers. Originally in the area tracking illicit bandit activity, their efforts meant the difference between life and death for many of the surviving crash victims. The Zephyrites began to take stock of the damage and assess their losses, including the devastation the crash had wreaked on their precious crystal cargo. Thrown from the sky, aspect crystals littered the sand and became targets for thieves. Though fractured, they still contained enough magic for a few seconds of power, and the survivors found themselves beset by inquest even as they struggled to rebuild. The Skrit, coveting the shiny quartz, stole entire baskets of the precious cargo and hid it away, even as the Zephyrites lay injured amongst the wreckage of their homes. Despite the threats to the Zephyrite survivors and the dire need to get aid to his people, shortly after the crash, the Master of Peace left Drytop and headed north. Realizing the egg was in grave danger, he hoped to traverse the Silver Wastes and make it to the Maguma on foot. It was a perilous and unavailing task. He was pursued not only by Eren, but by a growing number of Mordrim, who tracked him through the canyons. Thankfully, the Master had attracted the attention of the then commander of the Pact and their allies. Tracking the egg, the commander had followed the fate of the Zephyrites and determined Eren's sabotage. The resulting fight led to Eren's demise, but the Master of Peace was loath to hand over his precious cargo. His drive to see Glint's legacy protected pushed him into the Silver Wastes. But there the Mordrim forces of the Maguma were much stronger and more organised. They attacked the Pact forces stationed there relentlessly, in endless waves, and forced the Master of Peace deep into the labyrinth beneath the rocks. The Mordrim beneath the Silver Wastes were even more monstrous and savage. Despite his attempts to fend them off, the Master of Peace was fatally wounded. Realising the egg was close to falling to the jungle dragon, he passed the egg to the commander, desperate that Glint's legacy would be protected even as he died. Thus the history of the Zephyrites reaches the present day. In 1331 AE, many of the remaining Zephyrites returned to the Labyrinthine Cliffs for the Festival of the Four Winds. As a joint effort by Queen Jenna, the Lion Guard and the Zephyrites, the festival was a welcome respite from the turmoil of day-to-day life. Both Ellen Keel and Yvonne Nashblade attended, to cement the agreements between Lion's Arch and the Zephyrites, and to provide aid as they began to rebuild their ships and homes. The festival was well attended by traders and visitors from across Tyria. Strings of bright lanterns illuminated busy streets that crisscrossed along the cliffsides and housed a plethora of merchants and stalls. From the serene beaches to the busy docks, the festival was a hive of activity. The air of the festival was still tinged with sadness. With the Master of Peace's demise, the Zephyrites had suffered a great loss. Many Zephyrites spoke of their fallen comrades and neighbours. Yet many more were hopeful. With the safe delivery of the egg to the Exalted in 1328 AE, and the subsequent birth of her scion Aurene, the Zephyrites see the legacy of their beloved Glint being realised. As their society begins to rebuild, the relationships the Zephyrites forge with Lion's Arch and beyond speak to the optimism that spreads across Tyria in the face of the Elder Dragons. The Zephyrites hold fast in their faith in Glint. Without their dedication, the fate of Tyria and its peoples would appear far different and more dangerous than it does today.